Hi there, this is Robert, and welcome to today's show. Now, back in February, I had Dr. Alberto Paniz-Mondolfi with the Venezuelan Science Incubator join me on the Outbreak News This Week radio show. We spent the whole hour talking about the infectious disease crisis in Venezuela, and I'll put the link to that audio below so you can check that out for yourself. It's really good stuff. Now, he agreed to come back and do this show to discuss the political and the economic and the humanitarian crisis happening today in Venezuela. Now, there are three main policies implemented by Hugo Chavez since 1999 that really produced the current crises: widespread nationalization of private industry, currency and price controls, and the fiscally irresponsible expansion of welfare programs. So joining me, boots on the ground, from northwestern Venezuela, please welcome Dr. Alberto Paniz-Mondolfi. Dr. Alberto Paniz-Mondolfi, straight from Venezuela. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
Okay, well, I really appreciate you doing this. And now Venezuela has had some socialist policies for decades, with a few exceptions, and then came Hugo Chavez in 1999. What was Venezuela like prior to the Bolivarian Revolution?
Yeah, Bolivarian Revolution. One of many revolutions in the history of Venezuela.
Yeah.
So I think we should start, drawing a basic landscape and trying to put things into historical context, kind of to answer this question. So Venezuela, it's no secret, it's sitting right on top of the largest oil reserves in the world, estimated 400,000 million proven barrels. That's 20% of the oil in the world. So before the oil boom that happened in the 1920s, when the first oil drilling started happening, Venezuela was a rural country. People were still riding horses and walking barefoot in the fields. And the main economical drivers of Venezuela was actually agriculture exports. It was coffee, it was cocoa, like it's been for many of the Latin American countries. I usually advise people on reading a book that's called Half Millennial of Venezuela, written by historian, politician, and writer Arturo Pietri, which probably it impeccably gives you the portrait of how that rural Venezuela transited into an oil-focused economy. And that happened again in 1910, 1920. Of course, it was more profitable selling oil and earning from oil that continued the agricultural activities. So then Venezuela entered a period in which it partnered with British and U.S. petroleum companies in a 50% deal. And that happened until the 1970s, when the National Oil Company was actually nationalized under the administration of President Carlos Andrés Pérez. So the history of Venezuela has been of ups and downs, with a very strongly ingrained military culture since independence. And in the 1950s, we had the last dictatorship, which was a marvelous progress. The infrastructure progress of Venezuela was unmatchable. This was the administration of the dictator Pérez Jiménez. Of course, the cost in human rights was very elevated on violations, but that short-term dictatorship actually produced the modern Venezuela and gave us a modern Venezuela. And that is when we then transitioned to democracy, and Venezuela installs itself like one of the most long-standing democracies in the hemisphere. So in the 80s, stuff started going downhill. But before going into that, your basic question was, how was Venezuela before Chavez? And it was a country with a developing economy, I must say a decent quality of life. People could afford most of imported goods. The middle class was peaking, and Venezuela had a very robust healthcare and educational system. One can agree that the 70s were the golden era of Venezuela. Venezuela during the 70s was actually called Saudi Venezuela. And in the 70s, we had the highest growth rates and the lowest levels of inequality in the history of the country. However, when the 80s kicked in, we had an event in 1983 that was called the Black Friday. That was the first and biggest devaluation of the Bolivar, of the Venezuelan currency. And it was a strike to Venezuelan economy. And what happened thereon was that social disparity ignited and social division started to show up its face. Of course, the per capita growth fell, and its ultimate consequences came in 1989 in what we remember as the name of Caracazo, which were huge riots in the streets of the capital, Caracas, which actually started in the suburbs in a city called Guarenas. And these were 2 and 3 days of massive riots and killing in the streets. I was a kid. I clearly remember the image of the military on the streets killing people in an attempt to control the social turmoil. I also, Robert, remember words from a journalist, which I came to probably digest and assimilate at this point of my life. I can't recall who that journalist was, but he said, 1989, February 27, this was the day in that Venezuela looked for the first time into a mirror and did not recognize herself. That's how bad it was. So this was Venezuela before the Bolivarian Revolution, before Chavez. If you give me a couple more minutes,
go ahead.
There was, because it's important, we have to outline it. I always say Chavez was it was a trigger for what came, but Chavez was also the consequence of some vicious administration that happened because of the dependence of the Venezuelan economy on oil. So, in the pre-Chavez era, there was already a decline in democratic governance. You can pretty much say that oil wealth had distorted Venezuela's national economy. And this is pictured impeccably in a book that's called Venezuela Before Chavez, The Anatomy of the Economic Collapse, which was written by 2 Venezuelan economists. One is Ricardo Hausmann, the other Francisco Rodriguez. Actually, Ricardo Hausmann, economist from Harvard, is the Venezuelan who was just appointed by interim President Juan Guaidó to take over the representation of Venezuela in the Inter-American Development Bank. So this book is a must-read if you want to learn about Venezuela's situation and what took to the Chavez era. There was a drop in a flattening in oil production in the 80s and transitioning to the 90s. And Venezuela did not pay particular attention to the warnings that many Venezuelans had brought up. I talked about Arturo Pietri, which was a famous writer and politician. He used to say, he had a saying that was sowing the oil. You had to reinvest the oil in agricultural and gain alimentary and food independence. and you had to invest the money from oils in sectors of the economy. That did not happen. Of course, with a drop in oil prices and a terrible lack of investment, what happened is that this finally led at the late 80s and the decade of the 90s to a political fragmentation, which even more undermined the economy and started leading to political instability. So it wasn't. I mean, Chavez was brewed in a troubled Venezuela that already came with deep structural problems that were carried from the 70s. And that must be outlined, because Chavez is not a new phenomenon. It's not a guy that was brought from Mars and suddenly put in the country. So I think that pretty much answers that question.
Yeah. And a lot of times the Chavez policies, we've seen that in other places, if there's some kind of economic turmoil going on in the country, people are looking for this shooting star to solve all the problems. And my feeling is that's what the Venezuelan people were looking for out of Chavez. And they voted for him.
Yes, absolutely. So Venezuela is still a young country, a tribal country. When I mentioned it's a country with a deeply ingrained military culture, is precisely because Venezuelans have this messianic tendency. They're always looking for the person and not the collective. It's the person, the savior, the almighty politician who's going to come and solve all the problems. And that is part of the political culture of the very immature political culture of Venezuela. Let me tell you, I think if something, this deep, dire crisis that we have undergone over the last 2 decades has brought something positive, is I think for the first time, the Venezuelans are maturing political-wise. I think Venezuelans have learned that we cannot continue to look for a God and for a savior. I think Venezuelans have started to, feel that the country is a matter of all of us. And I think that this crisis have brought Venezuelans to take more mature political decisions in the future.
Okay, well, one of Chavez's first actions, and this is really kind of how it all started, was the nationalization of the agricultural sector. And his idea was to reduce poverty and inequality by taking from rich landowners and give to poor workers. So from 1999 to 2016, his regime robbed more than 6 million hectares of land from its owners. What was the consequence? The food production in Venezuela dropped by 75% in 2 decades. And of course, this is just a recipe for disaster economically. And Dr. Paniz-Mondolfi, this is just the beginning. Can you talk about the shortages not only of food in Venezuela, but also water? You told me before we came on the air, electricity, there's all kinds of issues with that. Can you talk about those issues?
Sure. So it's good that you brought that up, because I always say that Chavez was this kind of a tropical Peter Pan, right? Expropriating the lands from the people who apparently were stealing from the poor. But, he was also very clever. He did that on the right moment. So when Chavez came into power, the oil prices were on its lowest historically. But in 2008, that's when Chavez actually steps in his administration. Oil prices skyrocketed to the highest levels historically. We're talking about $150 a barrel. And that allowed Chavez to install his policies of, social programs. And basically people were in agreement with him. Like, yes, these people have stolen our lands. These people have stolen our food sovereignty, and they deserve to be unpunished. That is perfectly possible if you have a $150 oil barrel price. So you have tons of money coming in, people are not working, you have tons of social programs, and basically people take the decision, why am I going to work if I can get all these subsidized programs from the government? But then, throughout that period, it was a wicked period because it was populism as crude as it can get. And Chavez learned well, and basically with the Cuban advice, that populism was the best formula and way to keep addicts. And he applied that formula impeccably. On the other hand, meritocracy was killed and basically substituted with party loyalty. And there is where you come in with your recipe for disaster. What happened was that the talented people, the professional people, witnessed this early and said, you know what, I will leave the country. And that's what started happening. The Venezuelan diaspora is not new. The humanitarian crisis of the last year have precipitated the diaspora. But there was a first diaspora that escaped the vision of the world. And it was that the professional and the most talented body of Venezuela had already left in between 2008, 2014. Why? Because they were basically substituted by loyal partners from the party. Basically, the military started driving the administration. So what Chavez didn't take into consideration is that nothing's eternal. And then in 2014, the oil prices plunged. And then Venezuela fell into a similar scenario in which Cuba fell after the Russia pulled out his help, and Venezuela was suddenly in a special period like that of Cuba. And that's where things started going downhill. So you mentioned first about the food stocks. Right. Well, it's a shame. I'll tell you, the minimum wage salary right now, as we speak, 2019, is 18,000 bolivares. So the minimum wage salary in Venezuela is actually $5. A university professor is making $8, okay? Now, we gotta put this into context. The standard monthly food basket is right now on $515 a month, okay? And you're making $5 minimum wage salary. So, you need to make 3.6 minimum salaries a day to cope with the minimum of the monthly standard food basket. Nobody in Venezuela is able to meet this. And that's why we have this humongous nutritional crisis. On the other side, because the agricultural industry was devastated, we don't have internal production. So what basically sustained the Chavez regime during 2018 and 2014, that was basically a honeymoon, was that you had the money to import the goods, but you no longer have that money. So that's foods-wise. In terms of medications, nowhere to be found. We, in our previous interview, spoke about that for infectious disease, you only count barely gaps 30% of antibiotics. Basically, they're nowhere to be found. And if you find them in the black market. In the black markets, you got to pay them in dollars. And you have a currency exchange control, and then you have hyperinflation. So basically, a 7-day course of antibiotics is not accessible to any common Venezuelan in the streets. Electricity. Well, Venezuela had once one of the most robust electrical grids and systems in the world. In 2007, like everything, the National Electric Company, the electricity was nationalized, and it started going downhill. There was a very deep infrastructural deterioration that was basically due to bad management and corruption. Corruption is one of the main drivers of Venezuela's misery, if not the main. In 2010, to give you some numbers, close to $40 million were allocated to invest in 40 projects of maintenance and to modernize electric systems in Venezuela. This failed. In 2013, we were expected to have over 5,000 megawatts, and what we had, we barely reached 3,300 megawatts. So all that money was gone. We're talking about close to $40 million. And we know that this was basically people who had, because of their party loyalty to the Socialist Party, they had access to the concessions, they had access to dollars in the currency exchange control of the government. They didn't have to go and look for those dollars in the black market, and all they did was big business. So here we come into 2018. Venezuela is highly dependent on a dam, which is located in southern Venezuela in the state of Bolívar. This is the Guri Dam. It's one of the largest dams in Latin America. So Guri has dropped up to 240 meters just above sea levels. From 2007 to 2010, it reaches the lowest levels that it had ever reached. This partly due to the climate change, but also to the aggressive and anarchic mining that's going on there south. And the Caroni River, which basically feeds the dam, has been severely damaged. So if you take into consideration that the Guri Dam supplies 70% of the country's electricity, here comes what happened in 2019. A big blackout that affected all 23 states of Venezuela for 6 to 7 days. What happened here was that one of the principal high tension lines, the 765 kV line, which comes from the Guri Dam, and the substations of the Malena and San Jeronimo B basically collapsed. It was not an iguana, okay? The government came with this theory of conspiracy that they have been hijacked electronically, and they were victims of a cyber attack that was directed from some obscure offices located in Chicago and Washington. Well, you know.
So that's where they were telling the public, Alberto?
That's what they told. Yeah, they said that this was a cyber attack, a very surgical and refined cyber attack from the U.S., and that they had detected that actually this had been driven from some sort of locations in Chicago and Washington. Let me tell you something. I was surprised to hear that story. I was expecting another story, a little bit more fantastic. You know, I used to tell my students, you know, down south we have the most ancient rocky formations on Earth, right? It's called the Gran Sabana, and these rocky formations are called tepuis. And we have a very famous tepui, which is called Mount Roraima, which actually inspired Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to write The Lost World. So I was telling my students, you know what? Don't be surprised if this government comes up with a story saying that a T-Rex or a pterodactylus came down from Mount Roraima and bit the cable and left us all without power for 7 days. So I'm really surprised that they came out with the Chicago and Washington history. Now, what they didn't take into consideration is that all the mechanisms, all the electronic and computer systems of GUI and all the electric system is analogic. So their cyber conspiracy just doesn't work in this scenario. But, you know, that's what it's all about. They build up these epics. And then we have water, right? So water is the drama. There are communities in Venezuela, I can tell you the state of Falcón, for example, in northern Venezuela, that haven't seen water in the last 20 years. Okay? 82% of Venezuelan homes lack continuous water service. The worst part of it is that 35% of our water reservoirs are either physically, biologically, or chemically polluted. So we don't even know if we have water, what kind of water we are consuming. And of course, add water and electricity, which is what happened throughout the blackout, and then you have the perfect formula for disaster. You can imagine a 30 million estimated people country without water and electricity for 7 days.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me go back on the food issue. And, you know, of course, here in the States, we see the media reports. People are eating garbage. They're eating dogs on the street. They're eating animals in the zoo, and all kinds of things out of desperation. And I read one report that there's a number of children that die on a daily basis from starvation. A lot of people have lost, you know, a dozen kilos of weight in a very short period of time. Alberto, is this hyperbole in the media, or if you look out the window right now, what do you really see? What's happening there? What's on the ground?
Well, look, I step out every morning from home. I live in a condo on the east of the city, and first thing I find when I'm closing the door of my house is that where the garbage is usually disposed, and I'm talking about 7 a.m., the moment I step out from home, there are people eating the garbage. If I take my kids to school, they will see at least 10 condos in which people in front of those condos are digging in the garbage for food. So this is every day. It's true. You won't find this in the media because the media has been censored. And after the blackout, this was even worse. So we had few journalists that continued to broadcast through radio. The TV is basically down. What you will find in TV is show. In the radio, we still had some journalists that used to have their programs, but that's over. We don't even have critic journalists on the radio anymore. So there is a very severe censorship, information-wise. But this is happening. Social media is a different story, and social media is what has allowed Venezuelans to keep up with accurate information. Tons of fake news, yes, but there are NGOs that provide good info, and you know that what's happening is really bad. So in terms of nutrition, you say 12 to 15 kilos. Well, you know, no, 19 kilos a year. That's the media that's been estimated. Caritas, which is a Catholic church NGO, has done a pretty good job on keeping up with the nutritional indicators. The Bengoa Foundation as well. The Catholic University Andrés Bello and several plans they drive have been taking a close look into this. The Venezuelan Society of Pediatrics as well. So all these numbers have been accurately reported. Of course, the most vulnerable sectors of the population that have succumbed to the nutritional problems have been the children, the babies, and the elderly. And I'm telling you, you know, they don't deserve this. Elderlies are giving peanuts as a pension. You know, it's not worth these grandpas and grandmas stand for hours and even spend nights in front of a bank to cash a pension of $2 or $3. So if you want a personal experience, my wife was at a supermarket yesterday, and then the supervisor of the supermarket starts complaining to the cashiers that they have to be more vigilant. And then my wife is asking, well, what's happening? What's all this about? And it was a poor grandpa that was you can't even call this stealing, you know? This old grandpa was dying of hunger, and he had put an onion and a couple of tomatoes in his pockets. You know, give me a break. Not even to buy a couple of tomatoes and an onion, you know? So there went my wife and said, you know what, let's pay for the grandpa's tomatoes and the onions. And that's how many Venezuelans are trying to act in solidarity. So what you've been reading is the total truth. It might be more crude than what you think. It's awful. It's an awful social picture. It is.
Let me just piggyback on what you said about your personal situation real quick. Now, you said you're living in a condo. Your kids you're taking your kids to school. Your wife can go get groceries. So are you just in a different economic stratus than what we're hearing? Because you're a physician?
I tell people this, you know, this is like Cuba, right? Middle class, if you want to include me, I'm not even middle class anymore. I don't even have a home, okay? I live with my in-laws. If an MD today in Venezuela with a PhD, master's degrees, and 3 specialties and subspecialties like me had to buy a home, forget about it. With my earnings, I would spend at least 40, 50 years. I would have to work for months to pay a monthly rent. So that's not possible. Yeah. Still, you make some money to survive, okay? Say I can probably have a bit more access. Say I can buy, that day I could buy the tomatoes, the onions for grandpa that's starving. And then I could buy probably some bread and 300 grams of cheese that would build up to half of a minimum wage salary. Till there. That's it.
Gotcha.
We're basically burning our savings. And, you know, I'm not ashamed. You know, we need to put the Venezuelan truth out there. And on my 42 years and a marvelous career, I'm not ashamed of saying that I've been for the last 3 months living on my parents' savings, life savings. So I think for those Venezuelans, those professionals like me that decided to stay in the country, it's not that we can comfortably move at another level over the population. We barely manage to survive on a daily basis, okay? Say we do not depend on a pension, all right? We still have a bit of, you know, comfort area in the middle of the disaster, but it's fading away. It's fading rapidly. And we're basically all now leveled down into the poverty trap.
There's been a lot of, you know, you talked about this. The welfare programs have been off the charts. I know there's been at least 6 recent minimum wage hikes, which kind of useless when you got such hyperinflation. The nationalizations implemented by the regime, this massive, colossal government deficit, and basically what a lot of countries are doing, they finance their government by printing money, running the printing press, and that's what Venezuela is doing too. So that really leads me to the big issue. I mean, the really, really big issue is the hyperinflation. And you told me on the radio show it was about 1.3 million% in 2018. And you told me it was projected to be 10 million%. Prices are doubling there about every 3 weeks, maybe less than that. So, Alberto, what does it cost for some of the basics, say milk and eggs and bread? It must take years and years to purchase. Say, if you wanted to purchase a car, you'd probably have to work for 25 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's the reality?
400 grams of cheap cheese. Okay? 4,000 bolivares. Okay? Minimum wage salary, 18,000. Say, 1 liter of milk. 1 liter of milk. 7,000 bolivares. That's half of a minimum wage salary. And that's what I'm saying. The minimum wage salary is $5. A full-time professor in a university earns $8 a month. And the minimum monthly food basket is estimated conservatively in $512. So you just can't make it. How are Venezuelans surviving?
Good question.
Well, because they receive money from the people who have left the country, their family members. I think that is the main source. Venezuela in the last week has started a kind of accelerated dollarization process. So people now are paying in dollars. This is another story. The first day of the blackout, I traveled to a town that's called Quibor, right? It's a rural town in Lara State. And I stop at a store of some friends and I say, hey, listen, all the ATMs and all the purchase machines are down. The banking system is completely out. And nobody in Venezuela has cash. You don't know where all the money that's being printed is. Local currency is nowhere to be found. So I sit down at the store and I say, so let's make a deal. Can I take some of these goods just to survive the blackout? And then later I will come and pay. And they're my friends. They trust me. That's what we did. But they offered me a coffee. I'm having a coffee at the store, and I'm looking people coming in, and this is very poor people. This is a huge agricultural settlement, and people are stepping in the store and paying in euros, paying in dollars, paying in Colombian pesos, okay? The level of desperation is that I saw some people that were actually offering to exchange a pig for bread, right? So this is the kind of economy you're seeing in the streets. It's wicked. It's hard to understand if you don't live on it on a daily basis.
Okay, let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about the current regime. Of course, Chavez died in 2013, I think, and he was Maduro took his place. He was the vice president at the time, I believe, right?
Yeah, there was tons of movements there.
Yeah. So who, Dr. Paniz-Mondolfi, who is Nicolás Maduro? Explain that to the American people. Who is he?
Well, Chavez and Nicolás Maduro are Venezuela's worst nightmare. I think this country never in its wildest dreams could have imagined this would happen. As a Venezuelan who's been affected by the crisis, I can be very visceral on my opinions. I will try to be as pragmatic as I can. I will try to be a scientist in this analysis.
Okay.
I have no clue who Maduro was before coming into government. Was he linked in the Yalta movements of socialism and communism? He was. There's proof of it. Did he travel to Cuba when he was studying whatever he studied, which we don't know? He did. There's plenty of pictorial memorabilia. There's pictures of his trips to Cuba. But whatever pertains his, first steps in socialism are theories of conspiracies. What we do know is that he was a bus driver from the Venezuelan metro system. probably drive the bus twice, but he was a very active union member. And that's where he comes into politics. So when the Chavez project starts brewing, he starts working with some of the ideological members of Chavez. I actually remember he was a bodyguard of Jose Vicente Rangel, who was one of the masterminds of the Chavez project. But he really pops up into the political tribune in 1999 when he's elected a member of the National Assembly. And that was the National Assembly that actually crafted the new constitution that gave grounds to the Chavez project. After 1999, throughout 200, I would say 2000, the year 2000, I want to say 6 and 2013, I think, it was a prolonged period. He was in a very important position. He was Chavez's Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I see these years as pivotal years for consolidating his relationship with the rest of the socialist world and the building up of the Latin American socialist bloc, which started to build up in that decade. So you're right, in 2012, he is named vice president by Chavez. And then here is where cancer kicks in. Chavez falls ill, and there's a very rapid movement, right? And in December 2012, I clearly remember, I was in Boston at that time, Chavez calls Venezuelan and calls Maduro to succeed him if anything happens, or if the worst case scenario would happen, which actually did. So he comes from vice president, and upon Chavez's death, he assumes the temporary presidency of Venezuela. At that first time, he calls for elections. Soon after he calls for elections, those elections happened early in 2013 and were against the opposition leader Enrique Capriles Radonsky. What happened in those elections? We will learn one day what happened. Did he actually win the elections? Who knows? Whatever happened was a very close and narrow result between them. My personal gut feeling is that he actually lost the elections, but I don't hold the truth for that. But, you know, the vicious electoral system of Venezuela could probably lean you towards that decision. Nevertheless, he makes it to be the president. And at that time, there was still very solid support from the international community and his Latin American partners to support him. So, two very important events happen when he consolidates his presidency. One, both happened in 2016, and they're very important, okay? And in 2016, he calls for a state of economic emergency, whatever that is. Definitely not in the Constitution. And short after, he calls for a state of constitutional emergency. Okay? In 2017, so he had majority. So in these two calls for economic and constitutional emergency, he also asks the National Assembly for supra-constitutional powers. Okay? At one point, he loses, right? But after, he wins. And then comes 2017, when he calls for the election of an illegitimate lawmaking body, which we all know, he called the National Constituent Assembly, which has no constitutional grounds at all. I will stop here, and again, as I did before, I want to recommend reading a book that's very important and enlightening to understand this 2016 call for supraconstitutional powers, and that the installment of this lawmaking body, illegitimate lawmaking body, which is the National Constituent Assembly. I recommend people to read a 2018 book published by Levitsky and Ziblatt at Harvard, which is called How Democracies Die. This is an important piece of literature because it basically talks about the breakdown of mutual toleration, which is something that we've been talking about and happened throughout the Chavez era and basically deepened in the Maduro era. But the important part in the Maduro administration is how Levitsky and Ziblatt basically make a carbon copy of applying constitutional hardball. And this is what happened. And this led to an institutional meltdown in 2016 and 2017, which has led the international community to question the legitimacy of Maduro's government. So that's important to understand the Maduro path, okay? Then on January 2010, he runs again for election. He calls for elections, and on May 2018, the elections happen, a sham election where he says he won with 68%. I'm telling you, I drove all over the city. I didn't see one single person voting in any center whatsoever, okay? And we know that actually voting attendance was actually up to close to 50% less than the first election that he was elected back in 2013. And then he takes possession illegitimately he takes possession on January 2019. So that's his path. That's Maduro. The Maduro era has been more primitive, aggressive than the Chavez era in terms of political violence. If you ask me to define it, it's been exponentially driven by an increase in mismanagement and corruption. It basically made disappear entirely the commercial private sector. I think it's in this period where suppression of individual freedom was consolidated in Venezuela, and with that, human rights violation escalated to unprecedented levels. Then comes the humanitarian drama with the shortages of food and medicine, the exponential increase of corruption. But this is probably one of the most perverse man-made crises that contemporary societies could learn of. And Maduro is basically sustained by a military administration that at the same time is sustained by drug trafficking and all whatever kind of vicious you could imagine. So this is Maduro path, and this is a short picture of what the Maduro era is.
Yep. Now, clearly in these kind of situations, while the majority of the populace is struggling, and in this case, some are dying, there are some people that are doing well. So other than Maduro, who's doing well? The party leaders? These people are living large in luxury. Am I right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's a good point. So, I forgot to tell you at the beginning of this, I've dropped a couple of books for you all there. I think another book that is a must read to try to understand the Venezuelan complexity is actually a book called The Paradox of Plenty, the oil booms of the petrostates, right? This was written by Terry Lynn Carl, and it brings a lot of Jeffrey Sachs concepts in 1995 when he was back at Columbia University. And basically the theory of the paradox of plenty says that those countries that have abundant natural resources are usually those with crippled economies and crippled democratic systems. But there is always a rich elite social status that prevails. And in Venezuela, you nailed it. It is those who are connected to the high government. The high government and who actually are loyal to the party. And these people are making big business because despite sanctions, Venezuela still has tons of money. But you know what? This is also what I always tell my students. Infectious diseases do not know about bank accounts. They don't care about money. TB will infect the poor as it will infect the rich. There's always going to be an equal spillover to whatever social status you are, okay? Same thing happens with Venezuelan infrastructure. You can drive a couple of blocks down where I am sitting talking to you, and you will indeed find luxury condominiums. Luxury. You would find homes with swimming pools, state-of-the-art, Hollywood star mansions. Yes, but what? Without power, without water. That's the thing. And I think that's the important take-home lesson of when the electricity collapsed, is that no matter how you create your corrupted bubble and you're not down to earth with the majority of the country, you will also be touched at the end by the crisis. Of course, you also find the other side of the coin, which is money laundering. So you would find beautiful buildings, but they're inhabited buildings. Nobody occupies these buildings. You don't occupy a building, you start getting, infrastructure starts collapsing. So it is a very select and elite group of corrupt population that have access to the very few, let's say, privileges that this sick, corrupt society can offer.
Who is Juan Guaidó?
Oh, so again, I think we kind of have to have a bit of a background. We've talked about what Venezuela was in the 70s, how a decline in the democratic institutions and political fragmentations led to Chavez. Then we talked about how Chavez very cleverly mounted a parallel state and provoked an institutional meltdown that continued throughout the Maduro era. And there has been an important implosion within the unified socialist party of Chavez. But it has also happened in the opposition. Venezuelans have undergone a process of learned helplessness. This process of learned helplessness has happened because of the many failures of the opposition, which have had enormous difficulties in coming up with unified policies to counteract the Maduro and the Chavez regime. There have been a varied and a plethora, a myriad of political parties that actually made life within the opposition, and at times it's been very difficult to have them reach a consensus. Probably being one of the main points, the leadership of that consensus. Because of the political ego, probably, you know? But the times of the people out there in the street is not the times of politics. We cannot wait for politicians to come up with a consensus decision to get us out of this trouble. And that had, to one point, led the Venezuelan citizen to a state, to reach a skeptic state towards their leadership. So there was a point in which we didn't trust our leaders, to tell you the truth. We were exhausted. We still are. But then we kept asking, why don't we have an outsider come in the game? Why can't we have somebody totally out of the game come in and assume that leadership? And then came Guaidó. Of course, Guaidó comes from one of the four most prominent political parties of Venezuela, which is Voluntad Popular, okay? Then we have Primero Justicia, then we have Acción Democrática, and then we have Un Nuevo Tiempo, right? Those are the four main political parties. And Guaidó comes from Voluntad Popular, but he was a guy that was not a public politician. So when he comes serendipitously in the political arena, because he was called to be the president of the National Assembly by consensus taken 4 years ago, because it was a 4-year term for the National Assembly, and then each of the main political parties took 1 year. This last year corresponded to Voluntad Popular. Having his main leader, Leopoldo López, in jail, right? Juan Guaidó, who was the chief of the political fraction of that party, was the man who was called to assume the presidency of the National Assembly. So he was an outsider that basically and suddenly popped out and nobody knew about him. And he came in a very special moment because all the political elements had ingrained into severely militate against Maduro's legitimacy. So what happens is that Maduro calls for the constitution of the National Constitution Assembly. He goes into elections which are not legitimately and are not recognized by most of the international community, and he takes over in January. Then what happens is that Guaidó comes in as the president of the National Assembly and calls for a constitutional crisis provision invoking 3 articles from the Constitution, which are Articles 233, 333, and 350. And these articles are called to restore democracy, okay, in illegitimate grounds. So that's what actually Guaidó did. And then he takes over, based on these articles, as the interim president of Venezuela. So on constitutional grounds, that's what he is. Who is Guaidó? He's a young, promising opposition leader. He has an impeccable work record in the parliament, and he also has a very strong social work projection in his native state of Vargas, which has been very severely affected the state by poverty because it also suffered a national catastrophe when the Chavez administration started. So Guaidó can be actually defined as an outsider who comes in at the right time. He comes with fresh new ideas, and he basically brings hope in that a political change might be possible in Venezuela.
But Alberto, he is a politician, though, and politicians love power. How can you be sure that he's not going to follow in the same footsteps of predecessors?
Well, that is going to depend on how he builds up his capacity to articulate street actions and social protests while capitalizing and creating a broad political project that is inclusive to most, if not all, sectors of the Venezuelan society. And this has to happen on an independently fashion of the political affiliations. And I think he is working on that. You can pretty much see that he's leaning towards that side. We haven't been lucky, though, because the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis has been heavily politicized, both nationally and internationally. But that does not, I think we still have to put our hopes on him. And I think that for the first time, Guaidó has generated a phenomenon in that most of the Venezuelan leaders of different other opposition parties have actually lowered their ego and have understood that this is the right moment, if not the last opportunity we have to rebuild and restore democracy.
What do you want and what do you expect from the United States?
Well, the United States...
Well, let me just say, Alberto, my concern is I'm all good with the humanitarian aid and that kind of stuff, but I fear military action. That's what bothers me.
I know.
Yeah, I mean that frightens me.
Absolutely. So I think the United States has a fundamental role in re-establishing democracy by sending a clear message in that no impunity, there will be no impunity for human rights violations. And it's not only the United States, it's the international community who is called to guarantee the life and liberty of Venezuelans. I do not share the opinion of a U.S. military intervention. I am totally against that. I think the U.S. is doing a brilliant job on instituting sanctions. I think the sanctions have played a pivotal role on weakening the Maduro structure. However, these sanctions have to be well planned in the scope that they cannot put in risk the most vulnerable sectors of the population, and that these sanctions should be designed in a manner that they should not deepen even more the dire humanitarian crisis that we are going through. Those babies that today are dying of hunger in the hundreds all throughout our nations have no time to wait. Actions have to be taken immediately. I think the sanctions are the right way to go, but in the bottom of my heart, this is not a responsibility of the US. This is the responsibility of the international community as a whole. And I do think that we should call at one moment for an R2P, a responsibility to protect. And, you know, the Security Council of the United Nations failed to call for a responsibility to protect act with the Syrian crisis. And this has brought a very sad outcome with over 100,000 deaths, people leaving their country or forced to leave their country. So what are we going to do? Are we going to allow a second Syria to happen in the Western Hemisphere now? Venezuela, unfortunately, is a country that's living a war crisis without a war. You know, let's talk about the massive migration. Venezuelans have left on the millions since 2015. The Venezuelan diaspora is estimated to be 3.6 million since 2015. And if the situation continues to evolve as it's ongoing, conservative estimates are that it could escalate to 6.5 million by the end of 2019. So Venezuela is going to lose a third of its population due to this crisis. Let's put it in numbers again. 1 of every 12 Venezuelans have left the country. Driven by violence, driven by hyperinflation, driven by food and medicine shortages, all what we have discussed throughout our talk. 2.6 million have left to the immediate neighboring countries, Colombia and Brazil. This is the burden that the Venezuelan migration is actually inflicting in our neighboring countries. Only Colombia is harboring around 1 million migrants, with about 3,000 persons crossing the border on a daily basis. So also other countries, in a minor degree, are feeling the impact of the Venezuelan migration. Close to 500,000 people reaching Peru through Ecuador. That's significant. And as time passes, it keeps on getting worse. So what's really shocking about this is that, you know, we're talking about an estimated 2.9 million migrants, Venezuelan migrants in 2017. This is more than 2/3 of the population of 5 countries, okay, who actually inhabit war conflict areas, okay? War conflict areas. We're talking about countries like Syria. We're talking about countries like Afghanistan, South Sudan, Burma, Somalia. So Venezuela is actually building up to 2/3 of the diaspora of these countries who are actually in war. So this should, you know, kind of draw the dimensions of what the Venezuelan problem is, which doesn't seem to be pictured quite clearly in the media nowadays. And to wrap up again, I don't think this is a sole responsibility of the US. I think this is a responsibility of the international community as a whole. And I think that this is the time to redeem the errors that were committed with Syria, about the responsibility to protect. And I think that the Security Council should call upon negotiations, and an R2P should be put into place as the international community should be mounting pressure and calling upon WHO General Director to put into place a public health emergency of international concern policy over Venezuela. Because of what we had talked before of the resurgence and the spillover of endemic diseases to neighboring countries across Latin America.
Yeah, it's amazing they haven't moved on that already. Alberto, as you may know, maybe you don't, but socialism or various strains of socialism are being pushed in the United States today. A really, really bad idea in my view. What would you say to Americans about that?
I would say that any type of political tendency that violates individual rights, justice, and the rule of law is unacceptable. A big part of socialism is about that. I think populism is the dangerous phase of socialism. There have been socialist regimes that have not sustained themselves in the perversions of populism and have actually brought good standing to their people. I am worried about the United States. It's my second home. It's where my grandma was born. It's where I actually had my education. It's where my kids, who are more Venezuelan than any other Venezuelan, were born. And they are more American than any other American. So I feel America as intense in my heart and soul as I can feel Venezuela. And I'm worried about what's happening. When I first came to the US to train, I read about the father founders. I read about the history of America. I said, you know, I have to learn about America if I'm going to live in America. And I went deep, Robert. I went deep in my readings. And somehow, and here comes the book again. Here comes the book again. I made it to this book called The Other America from Michael Harrington. That book probably didn't reach 1,000 copies when it came out. I think it actually made the pages of the public when Dwight McDonald wrote a piece for the New Yorker that was called Our Invisible Poor. And it's undeniable that America has endured also social disparity across the years. Harrington, at the time he wrote the book, was talking that about 25% of America was living in poverty. Actually, this book reached apparently the hands of J.F. Kennedy, and then it happens to have inspired President Lyndon Johnson to come up with his War on Poverty. It's interesting. It's a show socialist piece, so I'm usually skeptic and reluctant to this kind of literature, but it's enlightening, because then it's the life of Alberto in the suburbs of New York when he did his residency, and then it's Alberto in the projects in South Boston with their friends during fellowship training, and then it's Alberto during his postdoc in Yale, riding the shuttle with the veterans from New Haven to West Haven, and contacting with that part of America which also lives in extreme poverty. So, you know, I think that in all, there always has to be an equilibrium. Fanatism on both sides is going to be dangerous. I think the experiment of the 21st socialism of Chavez is a lesson to be learned to the world, that this can by no means be replicated again in the history of humankind. And I think that is my opinion. And I am worried that, that the United States is going to fall in a state of polarization, political polarization, because that is going to be the instrument of division. It's going to be the same instrument of division and political crackdown that was used by Chavez in Venezuela to consolidate his project.
All right, Alberto, any final thoughts on anything we've talked about, anything I missed asking you about concerning Venezuela's situation?
I think we kind of covered a lot.
Quite a bit, yeah.
Yeah. I think we do not want to be forgotten. Pragmatic scientist as I am, I follow the news, and I keep seeing Venezuela falling down from the headlines, and I think there's been, as I mentioned before, a politicization of Venezuela's humanitarian crisis, both inside the country but also at an international level. And if I had to convey a message to the world, is that we are not having a nice time down here, and that our ultimate fate, at least, for people who speak up like me, and are not willing to leave the country, our ultimate fate is to be arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and finally murdered. And that is what's actually happening to a handful of political leaders and social activists. And this is not showing up in the media right now, and it's devastating. So I think I'm optimistic. I would tell you that the turn with Guaidó and this resuperficialization of Venezuela in the last months have been important on boosting our hopes. But if the humanitarian crisis keeps on going politicized in the main political tribunes out there, this might play a devastating effect, and it's not going to turn out right. And I'm worried and saddened about that situation.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Alberto Paniz-Mondolfi. Thanks for your thoughts, and keep safe, my friend.
Thank you, Robert.